and the sunrise warms my soul. In the east the eagle flies and the red tail proudly soars. I'm on my way to a place of a spirit one. Grandfather, hear me now, I am on fire. Let the Sundance guide my feet to your desire. Show me visions for my eyes, and words like gold that shimmer in the sun. Way, way, way. Turn towards the south, like the water I will run. Sense and trust, the moonchild song is sung. I'm on my way to a place of a sacred land. My emotions and my will at their command, where the turtle voice is heard upon the land. The wise coyote prowls, the rattlesnake will call me to the dance.
Flathead Lake and River, the National Bison Range, rich agricultural valleys, snow-capped mountains, hot springs, endangered species habitat, wetlands teeming with fish and waterfowl, cultural resources dating back thousands of years, and sprawl. It creeps out onto the land like a spider's web, taking wildlife habitat and wild places that once provided solitude for tribal cultural traditions. New houses and businesses pop up on the landscape, and soon some places are no longer recognized by the elders. Native food and medicinal plants are tilled under or sprayed in an attempt to stop invasive weeds and insects. Highway capacity expands. The Flathead Indian Reservation is located between Kalispell and Missoula, two of the fastest-growing communities in western Montana. In the last century, non-tribal growth outpaced tribal growth 10-to-1 on the reservation, creating one of the most checkerboarded and complicated land ownership patterns in the nation. And in 1 century, more and more people have moved to the reservation who do not know the history, the unique people, or the significance of tribal sovereignty and the remaining homeland of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. The Flathead Reservation is the last home for 3 tribes, the Pend Oreille, the Bitterroot Salish, and 1 band of Kootenai people. Each tribe has its own unique cultural traditions and beliefs. For many thousands of years, the people gained subsistence from a system of hunting, fishing, plant harvest, and trade, moving seasonally over a large territory that reached throughout and beyond the vast Columbia River Basin. In less than 1/300th of the time of the tribe's existence in the Northwest, tribal life and tribal lands changed dramatically. The late 1600s and early 1700s introduced horses and firearms to the region, making intertribal warfare more frequent and deadly. Smallpox and other epidemics struck in the late 1700s. The early 1800s brought the fur trade that wiped out vast populations of bison and small mammals that provided food, materials for tools, and hides for shelter and clothing. The Hellgate Treaty of 1855, negotiated between the sovereign nations of the United States of America, the Bitterroot Salish, the Pend Oreille, and the Kootenai, brought the federal government's promise of peace, health care, education, tools, and resources that would assist tribal leaders in providing for the people. The chiefs ceded millions of acres of Aboriginal territory to retain the Bitterroot and Flathead valleys for their tribe's exclusive use and benefit, along with the right to hunt, fish, and harvest within uninhabited areas of tribal Aboriginal lands. But promises were not kept, and more lands were taken. First, lands were taken for government agents and the Catholic Church for homes, mills, agriculture, and schools. Then the government took the Bitterroot Valley, then land for the railroad, then land for individual Indian allotments, despite tribal delegations sent to Washington, D.C. to protest privatization of reservation lands. And the government took over 18,000 acres for the National Bison Range, nearly 46,000 acres for reservoir or power development, over 61,000 acres for state school purposes, and over 400,000 acres for homesteaders. By 1912, the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille tribes, as three nations, had less than 400,000 acres remaining, much of which was mountainous or inaccessible. While individual tribal members received private land allotments, some in 1908 and some in 1922, many eventually lost their land to tax sales or fraud. Today, less than 3% of the reservation is individually owned trust land.
And yet we're still here. One thing the tribe has done, also in retrospect, is that after the Indian Organization Act, we adopted the Constitution and began immediately to buy land back. And we have been doing so since that time. I think that's one of the most important, most impressive things that tribal government has done over the years to try to preserve what we have, what little bit we have left of our universe, of our homeland.
Lands were illegally taken from the tribes with little or no compensation. Yet the tribes have been purchasing back reservation lands at fair market value, spending millions of dollars. And prices are skyrocketing. Land subdivision has created smaller parcels that cost significantly more to purchase per acre than large tracts. In the last century, the number of tribal members living on the reservation grew by about 2,000, while the non-member population grew by more than 21,000, placing more than 10 times the pressure on the resource base as tribal growth.
Keso kyokiet nekenin kel aktsmaknek honen nalane aktsmaknek husawus kwashanin na akok yutlak is kalt kawitsnok nene kopa witsknok nas nene kalt kawitsnok husawus kwashane hus wahatlane kusarche katasha yakrat kikel omets kin kenas amax kamnoklo aktsmaknek Kate Ken, Sar Akako, no case, Sar Hamat, at Tin Matlatil, Kilken. Kam Nata Nako and Nata Aktmaknek, Skikil. Upshawasne, San Keninas Amax, Nas Akakna, so Akaknane Nako, Pamakosart Hits Hak, Zakona Kosart, Tsamo Yakaknake, Kam Noklo Aktmaknek, aye. There may have been significant site-specific materials that was in this area here. Now they're no longer there. And there was probably oral traditions of why they were there that only those people knew about. Those are now destroyed and will be never recovered. For this little vicinity here in the Big Arm Bay and the Elmo Bay, at one point was all Indian land. It was all Indian land when the treaty was forced upon to them and they were brought into this area. Prior to that, it was all their land. And what happened now, what we look is just the direction I'm pointing. You got Wild Horse Island, which is a state section now. You've got Big Arm Bay here at this point. A part of that area is a state park now. And then you have the lakeshore property, the shoreline is majority privately owned. There are certain sections here that's been developed so much that the docks are only like feet apart. This little area on way down to the Camas Prairie area was our natural grocery store. You had bitterroot, and you had camas, and the wild potatoes, and the carrots. What's infringed upon us now is we have these kind of plants that has come in along with the development and the different things that has choked out a lot of those natural foods that the ancestors used. An Indian comes here to pay homage to his way of life. This lineage of landscape here, what they call Cromwell Island, Wild Horse Island, and the islands that are over there, that's landscape tied with oral history. This little Dayton Bay, Elmo Bay, Big Arm Bay, those are tied in with oral history. There's a lot to teach the young people that they need to know that's a part of their life, you know.
Facing the expansion of U.S. Highway 93 and the impacts of more growth throughout the reservation, Salish and Pend d'Oreille cultural leaders told us,
the important thing for us to do is to teach our young people about our language, about our history, about our culture, tell them who they are, where they come from, so that you know who their family is, so that they feel that they belong.
For the people and the wildlife, this is our only home in this whole world. We don't have another reservation we can go to, and this is all taken up. And this home, kept the way we found it, will be a home for our children. They are dependent on us, each one of us.
When the sun goes down and it grows too dark to see, I look into the shaman's mysteries. I'm on my way to die and live again. Grandmother Earth, I cry, give me rest. I take my place with the woman in the west, the raven and the bear, the way of herbs and the cleansing of the earth.
Some non-tribal people say, that's all past history. It has nothing to do with us today. The past explains a fundamental difference in the cultural viewpoints that exist on the reservation. It explains why we need to manage growth for our own health and subsistence, and also to perpetuate 3 unique tribal cultures that exist nowhere else in the world.
Tribal government has made great strides in doing what it needs to do, what it sees as priorities, in protecting the resources for future generations relative to cultural issues, wildlife, and the human health and the environment, and also just human use, tribal member usage. It's a huge, massively complicated issue.
Tribal members first established culture committees in the 1970s to preserve native languages and cultural traditions. Tribal government created natural resources, health, education, forestry, lands, and other departments. And by 1995, we're managing over 100 different federal and state programs and functions through contracts enabled by the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1976.
As a sovereign nation, the tribes have managed the power utility since 1988. We've successfully started serving about 12,000 meters, and currently we're up to 17,000 meters. And these meters are owned both by Indian and non-Indian customers throughout the reservation.
The tribes created the first tribally designated wilderness in the United States, obtained a Class 1 air quality designation, fought to establish minimum in-stream water flows and water quality standards, adopted grizzly bear, wilderness, wetlands, forest, range, cultural protection, fisheries, and Flathead Lake and River management plans and ordinances. And in 1996, published a 2-volume Flathead Reservation Comprehensive Resource Plan describing the interconnection between cultural and natural resources. Life-sustaining resources are a #1 priority, connecting directly to cultural resources. These must be protected to sustain tribal people on a timeline of at least 7 generations. Extractive and developed resources are secondary. Resource protection is in constant jeopardy from today's economic development needs, growth rates, and misunderstandings about reservation property rights and regulatory enforcement.
Many people do not understand that property rights off-reservation are clearly different than on-reservation. Inherent and treaty rights still remain. Even though there are land losses, tribal water rights were not severed. And another example is subsurface rights may be owned by the tribe and individuals even though the surface rights were sold or lost. And unfortunately, tribal members may own a fractionated interest in trust lands that they are unable to use in any way without the consent of other landowners. They may or may not know these other landowners. And also there may be covenants or conservation easements that would restrict the development. Clearly, property rights on reservation are much more complicated than they are off reservation.
Coordination with a multitude of federal and state agencies, laws, and policies for each type of land and resource makes reservation land management even more complicated. At the local government level, cooperative land use planning began in the late 1980s with a memorandum of agreement between Missoula County and the tribes. In 1995, tribal planners formed an intergovernmental steering committee with Missoula Lake and state representatives to develop the U.S. Highway 93 Land Use and Growth Projection Study. The study produced a statistically valid public opinion poll where the majority of both tribal and non-tribal residents feel a clean environment and rural lifestyle are very important. More than 60% of the respondents felt preservation of farmlands and wildlife habitat should be planning priorities. More than 80% prioritized groundwater protection. More than 70% supported cooperative planning between the tribes and counties. With these concerns in mind, we mapped the reservation's prime farmlands, wetlands, and other critical wildlife habitat, vulnerable aquifer areas, flooding areas, and developed a land suitability model. Our recommendations were to steer development toward towns that have the capacity to treat sewage effluent, to provide clean drinking water and paved roads, schools, police and fire protection, and other services. Growth should be limited in areas that are less suitable for development, such as extremely steep slopes, vulnerable aquifers, frequently flooded areas, and areas with critical wildlife habitat. Information from this study, as well as past planning documents, established the foundation for subsequent growth and development policies for the reservation. Constant vigilance regarding Highway 93 expansion resulted in an unprecedented memorandum of agreement between the tribes, the Federal Highway Administration, and the Montana Department of Transportation, where as equal partners, 3 governments designed nearly 50 wildlife crossings, an access management plan, wider shoulders, turning lanes, and other safety and cultural amenities. Guiding the type and intensity of adjacent land uses within the highway corridor was the next step.
They're coming. Growth is happening. And we need to plan for that. We need to plan for that by making sure that we do the very best we can to identify the critical areas for protection, the better areas for development, and encourage all governments to do the same thing. And I think tribal governments taken quite a lead in doing that here locally. Other governments are coming along. I think that we need to just keep the focus on that and continue to allow the tribal departments and programs to do their job.
Tribal and county planners worked with University of Montana Law School students to draft land use regulations, but Lake County scaled back to solely address the issue of development density. The county's proposal focused on proximity to town infrastructure, sewer, water, and emergency services, but ignored sensitive resource areas. The Tribal Council asked for stricter densities on these critical lands, while many local residents opposed any density control. With the help of an Indian Land Tenure Foundation grant, the tribes hosted meetings with the county's planning board, staff, and commissioners to negotiate revisions to the density map. County and tribal staff and steering committee members spent countless hours meeting with the public and listening to their concerns. The Tribal Council urged tribal members and employees to write letters and attend meetings.
It's worth noting that if we continue to do nothing, there's nothing that will prevent this place from going the way of every other place that's done nothing. We don't have to look far to see the inevitable result of such an action. The Bitterroot and Flathead valleys have already lost much of what's made them charming and peaceful places with a deep sense of community. Their rates of population growth in the 90s alone were 35 to 40%.
And as I have looked at this process and see all of you here today, it makes me wonder why we're doing that. In the Salish language, I think a good way to sum that up is Yaya Chinesn Hampsi. And what that means is grandmother, I'm thirsty. And to me that means a lot. It means that we're here to provide for our grandchildren. We're here to be sensitive to their concerns and the issues that will be important to them 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 60 years from now. I can go back in my own history just 20 or 30 years ago, and the very thought of a meeting like this, it wouldn't have happened. It would not have happened. To be able to sit down with our planners and Lake County planners, break bread in the tribal chamber was a phenomenal circumstance, an epic day for me. And to be able to share, to be able to agree on many things, disagree on some, and let that be okay, is a sign of some real, some real healing in this area.
I will move to adopt the density map and regulation, a resolution of intent to adopt the density map and regulations as proposed.
Do we have a second? I second. Second to the motion. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. It's unanimous. Okay. We're moving on to
When the final density map was approved, future land subdivision could no longer exceed a density of one home per 40 acres on 4 major rivers and stream reaches, as well as other grizzly bear habitat where the tribes, state, and federal agencies had spent millions of dollars acquiring land and restoring habitat, and where 3 governments had spent a decade negotiating and designing the expansion of a national highway to provide crossings for wildlife, and to reduce the density of vehicular access points to improve highway safety. With agreement on density, the next step is guiding the type of land use along the Highway 93 corridor. Commercial and industrial facilities that generate large levels of traffic will only increase the potential for accidents if not sited in appropriate areas. Billboards blocking valued scenery can be sited in less scenic areas. Public opinion tells us that most reservation residents want these land uses kept near existing development centers or towns to preserve the rural and scenic integrity of the Highway 93 corridor. And the Federal Highway Administration, State of Montana, and the tribes have agreed to achieve that goal. In August of 2006, the Tribal Council hosted meetings with both Lake and Missoula counties to discuss the possibility of creating commercial and industrial land use districts within the highway corridor, areas with infrastructure, fire and police protection, and slower speed limits more conducive for traffic. The remainder of Highway 93 would be preserved as a safer and more scenic corridor for farmland, wildlife habitat, and low-density residential uses.
Coming in here in the last 5 years, between Pablo and Polson here, holy smokes, there was no signs. But now, every 50 to 100 feet, there's a billboard. I mean, there's a limit to things. I agree, they got to advertise. We have to advertise as a tribe as well. But I mean, there's a limit to things. If people want to see the mountains, you can look over here to see a billboard instead of a mountain.
You know, to my way of thinking, in all the planning processes, we all recognize that, you know, we're in it together, but that, you know, that if enforcement isn't going to be universal, it's going to be pretty hard to go ahead and proceed with anything.
I understand the desire for safety. I also am a strong advocate for personal property rights, and so it's kind of a tightrope to walk on that, and so I don't want to say, yes, by darn, there will be no houses or no businesses along 93, and then find that the law doesn't allow us to do that. And so certainly interested in working with you folks. We've had a great relationship with you for almost as long as I've been in this office, and certainly want to continue it. I think our interests are the same. We want to protect the habitat and the safety of the public the same as we do.
We are very interested in doing whatever we can as a local government to cooperate with your government and successfully work on a Highway 93 corridor plan that meets all of our interests and concerns. And also, of course, would like to look at renewing that MOU, and we'll direct our staff to work with your staff to make that possible.
I think that there's a desire, probably more so than I've seen in a long time, to really do things cooperatively. And maybe the density plan was one of those things that really brought that, you know, that helped make that bridge.
I think it's absolutely critical we find ways to work together. But I hope that we can also continue to influence city, county, state, all the local governments to really set aside those historical views about tribal government and really come around and work with tribal government, because I think together we can do a whole lot better job than we would if we have to really battle or fight over all of those decisions.
If you want to get something done for your people and for your reservation and for your community, you have to step up to the plate and say, I'm willing to go sit down with somebody that I may have had a very adverse relationship with, and just have a frank discussion with them and be willing to understand where they're coming from. And have an open mind. You may not agree with what they're offering, but have an open mind.
I think that we have to continue to assert ourselves as a tribal government, to require that building be done in a manner that's not obtrusive to our values, that doesn't encroach on our cultural areas in particular, that the other land developers, the county, the state, need to pay attention to our concerns, because we want this to stay a pristine place. We are people that don't just live today, but we live way into our future, and so it's incumbent that we protect this ground and this air and this watershed from overgrowth, from overuse, from pollution, because 7 generations now we're still responsible for that. So it's key. It's at our very core. Yeah.
We were here as Indian people far longer than the European contact, and that's always in our minds, that we were here before the counties were established, before the state of Montana was established. Our agreements and treaty was with the United States government, not with Montana, not with Lake County.
We struggle to hang on to our traditions. We struggle to do our customs. Our language is endangered. All the components that make a group were endangered. So those things, if we could keep that growth from overstepping its boundaries, the Kootenai people have a chance to keep their ways of life going.
In the deepest night, the stars watch over me. Old woman of the north, my mind seeks clarity. I'm on my way to the northern winds. Let the thunder and the lightning carry me. Lay my thoughts to rest and send me into sleep. The hawk and the buffalo, my dreams like crystal magic medicine. Way